2 days after the catastrophic collapse of a critical dam in southern Ukraine, rescue efforts continue with dramatic scenes like this taking place as the scope of the devastation becomes increasingly clear as each hour passes. But it's not just rising waters posing a challenge to residents in Kherson. Homelessness, the threat of disease, and floating landmines are all adding to the increased safety risk. In addition to the fighting, Ukrainian officials are accusing Russian forces of shelling evacuation areas and injuring 9 civilians. One, by the way, critically. Vladimir Zelensky visited the region earlier, and he called for a clear and quick global response to the disaster. Meantime, U.S. officials tell CNN that Ukrainian forces are being met with stiff resistance as they try to break through Russian lines in the eastern part of the country. I don't think it tells us anything, Zane, at all. Obviously, they're going to be met with stiff resistance. This is a war. But I think that the important news is the twofold. First of all, that there have been these probing attacks along the front line in Zaporizhia, which has involved Ukrainian troops. There have been using some of the NATO-supplied equipment. Now, this was always going to be an extremely well-defended front line, and a lot of the evidence, particularly on social media, is that the Ukrainian troops are meeting resistance in that area. At the same time, though, they are now reporting some significant advances over 3.5 kilometers, albeit down a fairly narrow corridor south of the city of Bakhmut. Then are those advances being reported by Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade? And this is what some of it looked like. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade is in action near Bakhmut, and they claim they are making advances around the city. But their attack is dependent on Soviet-era weapons, modern equipment from the USA, and NATO is apparently being held in reserve for a Ukrainian offensive. These aircraft will fly more sorties as fighting intensifies in a relentless cycle of war. Ukraine has now got added rage at what it's calling a Russian ecocide. This part of Kherson has suffered Russian bombardment across the river for months now, near total destruction from upriver. Russia is widely blamed for the collapse of the dam at Novokharkovka, which has been under its control since March last year. Civilians who survived the Russian occupation of their town and an offensive to free it are now facing down a new horror. Thousands have no drinking water. Here, a drone delivers help, an adaptation of a system originally designed not to save life, but to take it. Now, then, amidst all of this, of course, there's endless speculation about whether or not Ukraine has begun its planned counter-offensive. I think the efforts where they've seen resistance near Zaporizhia, these attacks that we've seen coming south from Bakhmut, and indeed the raids into Russia itself are all part of the ongoing shaping operations. And earlier on today, I actually sent a text message to a Minister Reznikov, the defense minister here, saying, "Has your offensive started?" And he sent back a message saying, "No, our counter-offensive started on the 24th of February 2022, which of course, is the day that Russia invaded Ukraine." Ukrainian officials reporting that at least 9 people have been injured as Russian forces target evacuations in Kherson. Both Moscow and Kiev accuse each other of shelling as rescuers rush to help people escape the flooding from a dam collapse earlier this week. One apparent attack erupting as Ukraine's chief rabbi was talking about the evacuation efforts. Look, the rabbi hitting the ground to take cover. Soldiers are heard yelling to get down as they move to a safer spot. Well, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visiting the region and meeting with aid workers today. Meantime, Kremlin officials say Russian forces have repelled 4 Ukrainian attacks in the southern Zaporizhia area. Now, CNN cannot independently verify those claims. Meantime, to us, senior U.S. officials tell CNN that Ukrainian forces are taking significant losses on both sides of this. Ukraine's deputy defense minister reporting battle gains around the eastern city of Bakhmut. He says it's still the epicenter of hostilities, but CNN has learned that the Russians have put up stiff resistance with minefields that have taken a heavy toll on Ukrainian armored vehicles. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade is in action near Bakhmut, and they claim they are making advances around the city. but their attack is dependent on Soviet-era weapons, modern equipment from the USA, and NATO is apparently being held in reserve for a Ukrainian offensive. These aircraft will fly more sorties as fighting intensifies in a relentless cycle of war. Ukraine has now got added rage at what it's calling a Russian ecocide. This part of Kherson has suffered Russian bombardment across the river for months now, near total destruction from upriver. Russia is widely blamed for the collapse of the dam at Novokharkovka, which has been under its control since March last year. Civilians who survived the Russian occupation of their town and an offensive to free it are now facing down a new horror. Thousands have no drinking water. Here a drone delivers help, an adaptation of a system originally designed not to save life, but to take it. Sam Kiley, CNN, in eastern Ukraine. Today, the biggest news comes from the Kherson region here. Due to the partial destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, the water has wiped out dozens of settlements and islands and caused a huge ecological and humanitarian problem. In this video, I will tell you how the dam was destroyed, how it affects the nuclear power plant, and how it affects the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. First of all, we need to understand the scale of the destruction. The areas that took the hardest hit are located in close proximity to the dam in Novokharkovka. The water levels increased by 5 meters and completely flooded the town. Some videos showed how the current carried whole houses down the stream. The walls of other buildings often collapsed under pressure, which resulted in the total demolition of the houses. The islands in front of the town have almost completely disappeared. When it comes to other settlements down the stream, the level of destruction turned out to be even higher because of their location. The settlements on the eastern side of the river were hit by the wave. By noon, 13 settlements appeared underwater, and it is expected that up to 40 settlements will appear underwater in total, because the hole in the dam gradually becomes bigger, sending more and more water down the stream. Apart from the settlements, hundreds of cemeteries, landfills, and also burial grounds for infected cattle were flooded as well, which means that there is an extremely high risk of contamination of the water with infectious and fatal diseases. On top of that, the flood damaged the oil refinery in Kherson, and some sources reported that hundreds of tons of oil spilled into the river. The only good news comes from the nuclear power plant. The engineers protected the nuclear power plant against such accidents. The power plant has two separate water pools operating in a closed circuit. The only times when the power plant takes the water from the reservoir is when the water level in the pool slightly drops due to evaporation. So even if the dam down, the stream completely disappears, the water can still be pumped via pipes. But refilling is a very rare event, and given that right now, the power plant only works at the 33% capacity and only uses 2 out of 6 blocks, there will be no shortages of water. At first, Russian state media reported that Ukrainians intensely shelled the dam and damaged the floodgates, resulting in uncontrolled water release. Ukrainian analysts responded to these claims by pointing out that Ukrainians could not even destroy the Antonivsky Bridge with HIMARS by shelling it for 2 months. The dam is an extremely powerful structure that can only be damaged by planting tons of explosives. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that this is exactly what Ukrainians did. Defense Minister Shoigu reported that Russian forces completely defeated the Ukrainian counter-offensive in the Zaporizhia region. Ukrainians decided to compensate for the losses by redeploying everyone from the Kherson region, and because Ukrainians were afraid that Russians would take advantage of the empty front line and again capture Kherson, Ukrainians blew up the dam. The Ukrainian side responded by pointing out that the hole in the dam is located in the middle, and since Russians had destroyed the bridge on the Ukrainian side, only Russians had access to the middle section of the dam, and only Russians could transport tons of explosives. Ukrainian officials claimed that Russian forces decided to blow up the dam because Ukrainians had gradually established control over all islands and were ready to open a second southern front and conduct an amphibious operation in fear that they would not be able to cope with the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Simultaneously, Russians blew up the dam and wiped out all Ukrainian positions on the islands. Interestingly, some Ukrainian sources pointed out that the same occupation officials that blamed Ukraine at first pretended that there were no explosions. The news about the explosions started appearing at 2 a.m. At 3 a.m., the occupation mayor of Novokakhovka reported that the news about the explosion is fake and that he is in the town and confirms that the night has been quiet. 15 minutes later, he said that Ukrainians were shelling the dam all night and damaged the floodgates. The analysts concluded that Russians tried to make a relatively small hole in the dam to flood only Ukrainians on the islands. Close to 4 a.m., they understood that they screwed up because the power of the water gradually amplified the destruction and the top part of the dam started to fall apart. As a result, the Ukrainian counter-offensive from the Kherson direction is temporarily cancelled. The river is 4 to 5 kilometers wide, so Ukrainians will be spotted and destroyed before even getting close to the other side of the river. Right now, Ukrainians are conducting an evacuation of their troops and ammunition that they shipped to the islands. Interestingly, Russians are doing the same because the flood turned out to be much bigger than expected. A lot of Russian positions were gradually cut off from the mainland and turned into shrinking. In islands in the morning, many Russian social media channels started warning all Russian soldiers that they only had 2 hours to live, not 3 days. This means that Russian forces were preliminarily informed to abandon their positions. However, because timing turned out to be off, not all Russian soldiers could be saved on time, and many of them were wiped out by the current because the flood turned out to be much more severe in the long run. Russians may even end up inflicting more damage to themselves. Some Ukrainian analysts reported that many parts of the first line of Russian defense have already appeared on the water. Most of the ammunition and equipment will not be saved. The trenches will turn into pools and the fortifications along the bank will be wiped out. The water is expected to recede in around 2 weeks, and it is unlikely that the Russians can resupply the whole Kherson group simultaneously as the water level upstream is rapidly dropping. The width of the river in this region can shrink to the point where Ukrainians will unlock a new direction for an amphibious attack and will be able to pick the place on the 250-kilometer front instead of just 70. Such an attack will be even more destructive to the Russian plans as they will not be able to deploy enough troops to police the whole eastern bank while simultaneously defending against the counter-offensive in Zaporizhia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is experiencing the most difficult days of his leadership period on the territory of Ukraine since the Russian army, shaken by the recent big offensive plans of the Ukrainian army, cannot show enough strength on the battlefield. Putin resorts to reinforcements. As we all know, these units are mainly the mercenaries of the Wagner Group fighting on Ukraine's eastern front lines and the troops of the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov. But threats that the Wagner Group boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, would withdraw his mercenaries from Bakhmut brought the advance of the Russian army in the city to a standstill, which benefited the Ukrainian forces. Russian attacks on Bakhmut have now dropped drastically, while Vladimir Putin was looking for solutions to get out of this situation. This time, Wagner leader Prigozhin suggested that Kadyrov's soldiers fill the shortage in Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin argued that Kadyrov's troops should support the Wagner forces, which retreated to Bakhmut's central front lines. This situation led to the beginning of a new crisis for the Russians. Now a new relocation proposal has confused the Donetsk line as Putin struggled to halt the Ukrainian advance on the front lines in and around Bakhmut and turn the situation around. After the decisions to relocate between Wagner forces and Kadyrov's soldiers, the Ukrainians took the necessary precautions and built defensive fortifications on the front lines and placed their reserve troops in the most strategic areas. In addition, the Ukrainian army deployed its special forces to critical front lines such as Bakhmut and Marinka. Following this relocation decision between Wagner and Kadyrov, units in Marinka, the 1st Battalion and the 1st Tank Brigade from the 1st Army of Ukraine were waiting for the Wagner forces of the Ukraine Zelensky Dar Battalion and Azov Regiment to replace the Kadyrov units in the Bakhmut front line. In short, all preparations were made for the Ukrainians. Kadyrov ordered his soldiers to be killed in order to prove himself to Putin and to push Prigozhin into a more non-combat passive position. The Chechen leader mobilized his fighters to carry out offensive operations both on the Donetsk front line and in Zaporizhia. Kadyrov sent the elite Chechen Akamatsu battalion to Bakhmut and Marinka. Kadyrov had great confidence in this military unit. We think that Putin also wanted to trust the Akhmat battalion. Upon this order, Kadyrov's Akhmat battalion launched simultaneous attacks on the Bakhmut, Tavria and Marinka front lines. These unplanned attacks did not benefit much due to the defensive measures taken by the Ukrainians. The situation towards Tavria has not changed significantly in the last 24 hours. In the past day, Kadyrov's Akhmat battalion has attacked our Ukrainian positions 13 times, but the Ukrainian defense forces managed to repel all these attacks. Ukraine was prepared to attack the pro-Russian Chechens while the Kadyrov's Chechens were trying to make a sudden raid. They were faced with the pressure of the Idar battalion from the front and the Azov regiment from the flanks. The only option for the pro-Russian elite Chechen battalion was to retreat, and it was even claimed that the Akhmat battalion suffered losses during the retreat. As a result of the conflicts in the region, the Russian army had lost more than 500 in one day. In addition, Wagner troops who were trying to escape from Bakhmut were ambushed by the Ukrainian army and inflicted more than 100 casualties. Successful defense and attack of the 1st Army of Ukraine, ADR and Azov battalions in the direction of Bakhmut, Marinka and Tavria inflicted a heavy defeat on Putin, Kadyrov and Prigozhin's troops. The most striking here was the deletion of at least 2 detachments from the elite Kadyrov units. That is, about 100 members of the Chechen Akhmat battalion. While Kadyrov's most elite troops lost in a fiasco raid. Had Kadyrov gone out of his mind by making such a fledgling attack? Valery Churkin, spokesperson for the Joint Press Center of the Ukrainian Tavria Direction Defense Forces, reported that in addition to these attacks of the Akhmat battalion, the Russians carried out airstrike on the town of Orikhiv and bombed a total of 20 settlements in the Zaporizhia region. More than 90 attacks were recorded in the area of responsibility in the Zaporizhia region and 249 in the Donetsk region over the past day. The missile and artillery units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces belonging to the Tavria direction carried out 32 firing missions in the last day. The attacks in Tavria were repulsed thanks to the artillery attacks of the Ukrainians and the Azov regiment. In other words, in the first place, Kadyrov's Akhmat battalion could not find what he hoped for, and Russian leader Vladimir Putin became more and more enraged. But the absence of any explosion from Russia on this issue reminded of the dead silence. Because before these attacks occurred, Ahmed Kadyrov was very confident in his unit and was making plans without doubt that he would succeed. Besides the fiasco at Tavria, Kadyrov's troops were also conducting offensive operations on the Bakhmut front line to support Wagner's forces. However, as we mentioned, the Ukrainian army took serious security and defense measures in Bakhmut and did not separate its special forces from the city. Ukraine's Adar battalion and Azov regiment repulsed the attacks of Kadyrov's soldiers and counterattacked. The commander of the land forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Colonel General Oleksandr Kursky, reported that the members of the battalion destroyed Russian soldiers, Kadyrov's troops and Prigozhin's mercenaries in the trenches in the direction of Bakhmut with the help of unmanned aerial vehicles. In addition, the Ukrainian defenders eliminated 107 Russian soldiers in the direction of Bakhmut, destroyed 3 ammunition depots and a large number of Russian combat vehicles. The total number of losses suffered by Russia during the attempts to capture Bakhmut exceeded 40,000. These striking reports of casualties increase the desperation of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, it was quite remarkable that the Ukrainian army was still victorious, despite fighting against 3 different military units in Bakhmut, creating a shock effect in the Kremlin while Putin still kept his silence about this issue. Why did Putin put up with this situation? It was already anticipated that the displacement between Wagner's forces and Kadyrov's troops would give the Ukrainian forces an advantage, because if you withdraw your troops accustomed to the region during a time when the clashes of the war continue, you will, of course, experience a stumbling block if you include new warriors instead. But in this case, neither Putin nor Prigozhin had another chance, because considering that the Wagner forces lost about 40,000 mercenaries in and around Bakhmut, it's unlikely that the Wagner group could provide sufficient military support to the Rus army. Therefore, a new military reinforcement was essential for Russia on the Bakhmut and other Donetsk front lines. When we look at the situation from Putin's point of view, we understand that things are much more desperate because the Russian leader knows that such a situation can only harm him if he has not lost his mind. But the state of the Wagner group is clear. Therefore, the Russian leader was forced to watch helplessly as Kadyrov's troops dispersed to Ukraine's eastern front lines. But this silence of the Russian leader, of course, had consequences. After Prigozhin withdrew his mercenaries and asked for support from Kadyrov, the failures of the Akhmat battalion in Tavria inevitably led to negative situations. In addition, the situation was completely reversed when the battalion resisted both the Kadyrov, Wagner forces and the soldiers of the Russian army in the city of Bakhmut and counterattacked and broke through the Russian front lines. After all this, the arrows now turned to Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin and Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. After the failures, hostility emerged between the head of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, 2 of Russian President Vladimir Putin's most important allies. Adam Delimkhanov, a close ally of Kadyrov, attacked Prigozhin on the Telegram channel after Wagner group boss claimed that the Chechen Akhmat battalion lacked the capacity to occupy Ukraine's self-proclaimed Donetsk Republic region on May 31st. Prigozhin, through the press service of his company, Concord, made a statement about the Chechen combat troops under the command of Akhmat Kadyrov, noting that the battalion has the potential to occupy certain areas, not the entire region. Another close ally of Kadyrov, chairman of the Chechen parliament, Magom Dodov, reacted sharply to Prigozhin for his daily statements that he claimed had created an atmosphere of panic among the Russian people. But from the very beginning, Kadyrov had offered to take over the clash mission in Bakhmut. Prigozhin replied that the Akhmat battalion would undoubtedly take Bakhmut. Now, the Wagner leaders claim that Kadyrov did not see enough in his soldiers, normally caused a violent confrontation between the Wagner-Kadyrov group. It is unclear whether Kadyrov's troops will continue their offensive despite the casualties. Wagner leader Prigozhin's next sensational statement is eagerly awaited. We'll see together how much longer Putin can last in this critical period in which he has reached a dead end.